We are live. Welcome to Crypto Law TV. I'm John Deaton, the founder and your host. I have a special guest today. I'm not going to waste any time. Everybody should be in a good mood. Bitcoin, I think, is touching 44,000 and whatnot. But I want to bring on Austin Campbell as my special guest. And I want everybody to know that this is the first time Austin and I've ever had a real conversation, and we've met. I didn't know Austin. I'm looking forward to meeting him, but I'm going to show you the moment that I became a fan and a supporter of Austin, and I'm going to play a clip real quick right here.
Regulation is currently chaos for stablecoins. If I am an issuer and I want to create a stablecoin, I technically don't know if I'm going to be answering to a state regulator, a federal banking regulator, the SEC, the CFTC. And it puts you in the same position as if you were out with friends and you were going to play, some sports game, and somebody tells you, well, we may enforce the rules of baseball or football or basketball, and we're not going to tell you which in advance, and maybe some of them will all apply at the same time. It's unworkable. And what this means, and it pains me to say this as an American, is that things are moving offshore.
All right, Austin. So when I came across that on X, formerly Twitter, I was like, wow, finally someone testifying before Congress who knows what he's talking about and is making sense and delivering the real message that's critical to U.S. innovation and how we're, sending it offshore. So let the audience know you're the founder and managing partner of Zero Knowledge Consulting. You're a professor at Columbia Business School. You don't get that easy. And so give us a little bit of who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, I was going to say I was challenged to poorly explain what I do for a living recently, and I told people I block-splain things, but I would say now what I do for a living is really living at the intersection of a lot of the complicated problems that are created by blockchains, because they really are a multidisciplinary instrument. And I think a lot of the problems we've had in this space come from people not appreciating all sides of that or the complexity of the interactions you get there. So how I ended up here is I started my career way back in the day in finance. I've been through distressed debt trading, fixed income trading at JP Morgan, where I handled a lot of like the weird products and global rates. And by the way, stop me if you've heard this story before, but one of the big things I managed after the crisis was a product where our goal was to keep a portfolio of wildly diversified bonds at a stable $1 NAV while people transact in and out of them. It's called stable value. It's a much bigger market than stablecoins. And then I was at Stone Ridge, which is NYDIG's parent, if anybody's ever run into them in the Bitcoin and custody space. I was at Citi as the co-head of digital assets, and I was at Paxos, where I basically ran the stablecoins for a while. So it's been a winding road through crypto, but very enjoyable.
Well, let me ask you now, and I've had a little bit of dealings with Congress I might share with you in a minute, but why did you personally choose to give this testimony?
I mean, the simple answer is they asked me, which is, a little bit trivial. Specifically, they asked me because at the time, the place we were with stablecoins was there was a lot of debate around this bill that turned on facts and circumstances. And one of the advantageous things about being a college professor is the only bias you really hold is in favor of like higher education. So they can ask me to come testify and know if they ask me a question, I'm just going to tell them what I think. Because like Dante, he's a friend of mine. I love him, but he works for Circle. He probably can't be up there saying something that directly contradicts Circle's position, even if he believes it. Now, I think he's pretty ethical and that's not the case, but like Congress will have doubts as they should. And so if you looked at that hearing, I think I was brought essentially to be a pretty if you will, centrist voice of reason because of both the TradFi and crypto background and having one leg in both worlds.
Do you get to speak individually with any of the congressmen or senators?
I have. I would tell you, you speak with some of them individually, but one of the things to remember about all of the Congress people is they're juggling like 500 plates simultaneously with their jobs. A lot of the real work is actually done by the staff. Yeah. And that's where you can be very influential if you know them. Like staffers are underpaid, hardworking, and constantly need good information on average. And it's an unenviable job, if I'm being totally honest. And so knowing a little bit about how the sausage is made, there are some reps and Senate people who would want to speak, some who prefer you go through the staff, some people in the policy or regulatory space. It's a weird sort of non-obvious network of people who get things done.
Yeah, I had a little bit of introduction. I represent people in asbestos litigation. That's what pays the bills. And there was a bill pending before the Congress that was going to end all asbestos lawsuits. But what I was shocked at is how little the senators and the congressmen know of the actual bill or the actual issues. For example, I had a meeting with the Rhode Island Senator, Jack Reed, who is more, I think, conscientious than some, and I gets into the weeds a bit. But, he said to me, the reason why I'm leaning toward the bill is that military folks don't have a right to sue. And I looked at him and I said, Senator, half of my clients are all Navy veterans who were exposed to asbestos. What are you talking about? You can't sue the Navy, but you could sue, the manufacturers. The point being is that it was lost, and that's what frustrates me. So my question to you is, do you find that to be the case? How do you feel that both the public and Congress, how well they understand crypto, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Well, I guess the proof is in the pudding. I wouldn't have started my consulting firm if I thought people understood it really well. So, I've already sort of put my money where my mouth is. I would say I think there's two layers to your question, which is one, do people have an understanding of the mechanical things they're doing with bills, laws, and things they're creating? And I would say on average, no. But in a handful of cases, yes. Like the average senator, the average House member has not spent a lot of time on this, and they probably don't know. But if you were to go talk to like Patrick McHenry or maybe Richie Torres, the answer is probably yes, right? So many people are following a handful of key leaders on these things, and then when they try to defend themselves, it gets very obscured very quickly. I would say, too, in terms of the public, people in finance, people even in crypto, almost certainly what happens is they got in through one specific angle and they understand that one vector. But in a multidisciplinary problem, that can sometimes be actively misleading, right? It's a little bit like, so think about the analogy of a car where all you understand is how the brakes work, none of the rest of the machine. You would have some very strange ideas about how cars operate on a macro level if that's all you knew, but also observed a car in the wild.
Right. Now, back to the thing about your clip that in testimony that I showed was your analogy, that which sport rules are we playing by? You brought up all the different regulators, and it reminds me, as I got involved in the Ripple case and XRP holders. And the thing that I found absurd is from a public perception, in 2014, the Government Accountability Office declared XRP virtual currency in a decentralized payment protocol called Ripple. And then in 2015, you had the FinCEN settlement that said you got to apply with the banking laws. And then in 2019, the FSOC's annual report highlighted Bitcoin, XRP, ETH, and Litecoin as virtual currencies. No securities kind of discussion in any of this. And then, of course, the SEC sued 7.5 years after XRP was traded, calling all XRP securities. And my point to you is you're more in tune with the Senate, the House, the regulators. Who should be the right regulator governing this industry? Because I clearly don't believe it should be the SEC, unless it's an ICO where you're using the funding to build the technology or something, maybe in that, small area. But other than that, I don't believe it should be the SEC, but I'd love to get your perspective.
Yeah, so I'm gonna start with two key points that I raise often so people understand the scope of the problem that we're addressing in attempting to answer that question. So one is the United States has a very unusual framework in that we have multiple regulators with competing jurisdictions over these kinds of things. If we zoom out and look at things internationally, and you look at like the Japan Financial Services Authority, who I'm privileged to know, and I have some friends there, or like the MAS in Singapore, where I know some people and again have some friends there. I would say the unitary regulators have in general done a better job than regulators who are fragmented in addressing this space. So the number one thing I would say about the United States is we don't have a single regulator who's capable of handling this thing because crypto is complex and multidisciplinary. Number two, I always think it's a mistake to ask who should regulate crypto, because when you start from the basis of a technology platform, you get some very weird outcomes. Like I recently criticized a proposal from Treasury to Senate banking on this basis, where I'm like, we can't start with the blockchain part, because if our stance in America is it's not okay to engage in terrorist financing through a blockchain, but it's totally okay to do it through like a private ledger, that's crazy. Right. And so what I urge is back away from the technology, look at the specific activities, and then we should be able to make some pretty clear determinations. So like to me, stablecoins look a lot like a banking product. They should be a banking regulator type thing. Tokenized gold looks a hell of a lot like a commodity. That's probably a CFTC regulatory thing. So to your point, I think things that are transparently like within the boundaries of the Howey test, right, should be within the SEC's world. I think there's been a few problems with that. One, the SEC won't provide any clarity on what they think that is. Two, the SEC apparently under the current chair thinks the Howey test is infinitely flexible and everything is a security in short, which is definitely not working as intended. And then three, the rules they've been promulgating to the extent they have, like SAB 121, are actively counterproductive to achieving the goals that they want. And quite frankly, it probably contributed to a lot of retail losses. So as I'm winding this back, if I were ranking things in the United States, I would tell you the three best regulators I've dealt with on crypto in terms of clarity, understanding, and execution have been the NYDFS, the NCUA, and the CFTC. I think one tier below them is the banking regulators, where I don't like everything they've done. I think they've been insufficiently sophisticated in some cases, but they at least have been pretty clear about what they're trying to do and like have views, and are like, expressing them. And then there's probably two or three empty tiers, and then the SEC way down the list, given some of the things that they've been engaging in lately.
All right. I want to share, let's pull up Austin's tweet about Library and Ripple. We'll get to the second tweet in a minute.
Oh, no.
Library and Ripple. Basically, you're pointing out here what is my biggest issue. My biggest issue with the SEC has been, where is the why not focus on fraud? You and I can agree that there is fraud that has ran rampant, right? In any industry, including crypto. And you've got Celsius and you've got FTX, yet we're focusing on Library in New Hampshire, truly a utility token for that platform. I know professional crypto traders who had never heard of the Library token, and so that's my biggest frustration. And I saw your tweet. And do you have any insight on why they're not focusing on actual fraud and going after these strict liability, violation 5? Is it just a jurisdictional land grab?
I mean, I think if it were just a jurisdictional land grab, there'd probably be a better methodology to it. Like, here's the unfortunate reality. The SEC has just not been even particularly effective at all times in traditional markets, much less crypto markets. I would tell you my personal view. It is a combination of the staff not having a sufficient understanding of the space to build strong cases against companies that they want to go after, partially exacerbated by the fact that when your leadership is irrationally hating on crypto, most of your pro-crypto staffers leave, right? Which is a huge problem, because like I'm friends with two former SEC like people who I think understand crypto really well and work in crypto. And the problem is they're not at the SEC. They work in crypto. You've been deprived of this expertise, right? And so that's one element. I think another element is just, quite frankly, they've had poor execution in investigating things and really bad target selection, again, informed by like lack of knowledge. I was an FTX skeptic back in 2021 when I was still a pariah for being such. And there were other people who were raising those concerns. There are plenty of straight up frauds from the ICO boom that nobody has gone after. And I would question whether the SEC is even aware of the existence of some of these things. And then if they are, how they're not selecting to go after those. The third part is I do think it's a jurisdictional land grab. Like, you can tell they're doing things purely for the headline value. Maybe the best example of this was dropping a subpoena which is completely needless, on PayPal the day before earnings, knowing they would have to disclose it. I want to be clear. What PayPal is doing in crypto is NYDFS regulated and basically pretty transparently banking products. So the only reason you do that kind of thing is to intimidate and for the headlines, because other things are coming down and the SEC is trying to keep their name out there. All of these things are, I would say, around my overall criticism of the SEC, which is that regardless of whether you are a crypto, like call it positive person or a crypto skeptic, what the SEC is doing is making a mockery of the rule of law. And what people should be worried about is that when Gensler is gone and the next SEC chair comes in, pick whatever the thing you like most is, right? If you're a liberal, maybe it's ESG investing, clean energy, like, health care access, things of that sort. If you're a conservative, go pick whatever you want, like guns, if you want to like go down those roads, anything works. And they're going to be able to weaponize this exact same playbook against those industries to cause all sorts of problems when you don't operate within the rule of law. And so to me, what's odious about the SEC is not their views, it's how they are abusing the system to inflict damage upon people. And what I am going to say are probably extra legal, extrajudicial ways to enforce that.
Right. No, listen, that's why I became a fan. You basically summarized my whole approach. When the SEC went after Ripple, Ripple wasn't necessarily the most favorite company out in crypto. Let's just call it like it is. And a lot of people thought, well, they dumped on retail, good for them. And I was screaming, hey, forget Ripple. Like if they limit it to just Ripple transactions, but claiming that all tokens, no matter who buys them, whether they know Ripple exists or not, or whether they're using it to transfer money on the XRP ledger or not, that everything is a security, the token itself. I said, that's so dangerous. And eventually they could come after the token you actually do care about, And so,
well, not just token. Like, why stop at token? Like, by that analysis, somebody explained to me how a Starbucks gift card is not a security or how eBay is not a securities exchange, right? So, like, one of my personal friends is Lewis Cohen, and I'm very lucky to know Lewis because he makes me feel stupid when I talk to him about things, which is always a good sign. But like, he's pretty clearly explained how this theory that tokens sort of like mutate in and out of being securities is totally crazy. Right? Because if you look at like Howie, at no point are the oranges securities, guys. That's just not how it worked. Like they could be part of an investment contract, but that does not turn the oranges into an investment contract. And I think, barring a handful of particularly odious examples, like maybe the Luna token because of the inherent transformation properties with UST and, vice versa, where actually that may always be a security, but it's because you built something into it. But with other things, I think the idea that the token itself can be the security is a fundamental misunderstanding of technology, right? Back to the point I was making. Like, I'm not saying there are not investment contracts or unregistered securities in crypto. There almost certainly are, but they're probably not embodied specifically by tokens any more than like, if I buy a pair of shoes from Nike and I have an expectation of profit because I think they're going to be collectible and in demand and I hold on to them, that somehow I'm engaging in a securities transaction. Like, guys, stop.
No, I know when I filed the embodiment theory sort of was born when I filed the motion to intervene, and the SEC came back and said, we're not saying the token itself is a security. What we're saying is that it represents all the promises and inducements of the investment contract. So it's like an embodiment or representation theory. Of course, they didn't cite anything.
Yeah. But then the oranges embody the value of, like, again, like, guys, either you mean it or you don't. And by the way, if you do mean it, I want to be clear about this so people understand how crazy that theory is. If they do mean it, the SEC has been completely and totally derelict in policing all forms of fraud in the United States economy basically since the 1940 Act was passed, because they've been asleep on the job across basically every single thing that is not specifically a registered security. So either they're so incompetent that it took them 80 years to figure out what their mission is and they should be disbanded, or they're lying.
This happened. I'm going to play some. It's going to take a minute, but it just happened today because there was a hearing, and Tom Emmer just posted this on X. So let's take a look at it.
When Bill Hinman was the director of the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance, he gave a speech on June 14, 2018, entitled Digital Transactions When Howie Met Gary. In this speech, he famously discussed how tokens can morph from securities to non-securities, and he stated that Ether is not a security. Ms. Sapanik, you reviewed and commented on drafts of this speech, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
When reviewing a draft, you said that providing, quote, less detail in the speech was better because the concept of a token morphing from a security to a non-security was a new concept and would generate a lot of discussion. Do I have that correct?
I believe so.
So you thought the SEC should give less clarity to the market rather than more. I understand you thought the token morphing concept would generate a lot of discussion, but when the industry complains about a lack of clarity, I see it was a deliberate policy preference. Does the current SEC chair share that view?
So again, that was today in a hearing. Tom Emmer was asking questions, and we learned, and what Tom Emmer was citing were the Hinman emails that were disclosed in the Ripple case. And we learned that not only did Valerie, who was considered the crypto czar there at the SEC, say, let's give less detail, the Office of General Counsel had said, maybe you shouldn't give the speech because it will limit what we can say about ETH later. And I was reading those, and just as a citizen, I was getting frustrated because it really is this, we just want to keep it vague to have all options in the future, and so what's your position on that, if anything? I mean, do you really think that's their fundamental approach? Just let's leave it as vague as possible? Because I think that just says we want to be able to prosecute anyone at any time at our whim. So let's be vague.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's part of it. I do not think that's all of it. But there are definitely people at the SEC who hold the view that you just expressed. You'll find a decent number of them in enforcement because they just want maximum flexibility to go enforce things, right? It's like to the man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail writ large. I would also say I think there's probably some serious disagreement inside the SEC about how to handle some of these things that also makes taking a specific position hard. Right. In that, one, they're probably boxed in by past conduct, and they, I think, are probably concerned about saying certain things that they may then have to apply to other industries with regard to tokens. Right. Like you have to be careful here because when you write these things down as your official view and you go to court, the SEC does not get to make the determinations a judge does. And typically federal judges, John, I don't know what your experience is, but in mine, they have low tolerance for bullshit, right? And so I would not be playing around if I were the SEC. I also think this strategy itself, as we've started to see recently, is leading them to very ugly places in court where there will be increasing questions from judges about, well, if you're not going to tell people what the rules are and then you're going to prosecute them after the fact, now we're into a lot of very basic constitutional questions about, the American system. And, this surprises people sometimes when I say it, but the SEC has probably been the single most unsuccessful major regulator in court of our financial regulators. If you compare their track record to, say, the CFTC, I would actually much rather be facing the SEC than CFTC from a probability basis.
Oh, well, no, perception becomes reality. And there was this perception that the SEC always wins. And the last 2 years have shown that not to be true. Now, you gave a perfect segue to our last topic about the SEC is that federal judges, don't tolerate bullshit. And so let's pull up Austin's tweet that right there it is, F the SEC. But you were really discussing this recent judge related to Deb Box. And what I want people to know is what happened here is the SEC went into court seeking a temporary restraining order, which, as you know, Austin, is ex parte. That's a one-sided event. So everyone out there, which meant Deb Box's company or lawyers, they're not involved. They don't even know that the court proceeding is taking place. And the SEC went in there and they made, some representations that were wrong. What's your take on that scenario? And do you think the judge will sanction the SEC?
So I'll start by saying I'd like to add one additional point on the TRO, which is that those are extraordinary remedies. A TRO is devastating for a company when you freeze all of their accounts. Imagine in your life, you get home one day and every single bit of money that you have in the system is frozen and you didn't even know it happened. That's what a TRO does to people in these circumstances. So these should only be deployed in extraordinary circumstances. So the fact that the SEC went into court, and if we want to be very favorable to them, were grossly negligent by not doing any of their work to figure out what had happened, because these bank accounts that they were alleging people were moving money out of, here's the allegation, Deb Box was closing them and moving the money out of the country. What was actually happening? Banks were closing them on Deb Box because of regulatory pressure around crypto. And then the money was being moved to a credit union. So the way I describe this sort of behavior when the SEC does it is it's a little bit like burning somebody's house down and then complaining that it was a fire hazard. Like, you don't get to do that if you're the arsonist. And so I would say this is very severe. One, it's a pattern of conduct with the SEC now. This is not the first time they're getting slapped around in court for, quite frankly, not doing their job before filing things. Right. You've seen similar conduct with Binance US. Jesse Powell and I had an exchange on X recently where he was alleging they're basically doing this in the Kraken suit. And I would tell you, given this keeps happening, that should probably raise people's view of Jesse's credibility and lower the SEC in this one. And then here. So my gut is they better have a really, really, really good explanation, which basically should be we were lied to by people if they want to avoid getting sanctioned by a judge. I would tell you, I don't think federal judges are going to look kindly upon people abusing the TRO system, especially not in this case where the facts were there and pretty obvious and they just didn't bother to get them.
No, I'm so glad that you brought up the asset freezer, because I forgot to mention that for the people to know exactly. Just 1 minute they go into court, you're not there to defend yourself, to say anything, and then your entire accounts are all frozen. Credit cards are being denied, checks are bouncing, all of that. And so it is extraordinary. And I hope the judge hammers them, but we'll see. I'm sure. I don't think there is. I mean, unless they're going to go in and say what you said, which is we just assumed that the bank closures was this intentional fraudulent conduct, and they can't say that.
You could just look. I mean, maybe I'm going to sound like a crazy person here, but has anybody considered calling the bank? You could just ask.
No, I mean, I think that's what a judge would probably say in response. Listen, you in your clip, you talked about, well, actually, I want to bring something up before, because something else just happened, and it goes to like the SEC's overreach. And, but let's pull up Joe's tweet that I told you before, right? Joe on X. Well, he posted this tweet basically saying that the SEC is requiring the spot ETF companies to disclose, basically these disclaimers of risks, if you will. And one of the risks is that Bitcoin could be determined as security. Did you see that? Because this just happened within the last couple hours.
Yeah, and I would say this is indicative of the problem with like disclosure in general, as somebody who's helped prepare like 40 Act prospectuses as a portfolio manager in the past, which is to say the way they've evolved, they're basically useless from a risk perspective, but the ultimate cover your ass exercise, right? And so what's going on there is you just throw in every risk under the sun that you think is material, that your lawyers think are material, or that the SEC thinks is material, regardless of how low the probability in reality is, right? Like, I had a disclosure attorney at one point jokingly say, like, honestly, like we should just go through the dictionary and find every single bad thing that could potentially happen and disclose all of it. And then you're going to be completely covered. And the problem there is, I would say these have zero signaling value to somebody reading. Like, go read a prospectus sometime, especially if you need to sleep. Go read a prospectus. But the informational content is probably on like 5 pages, but there's hundreds of pages of documentation, and most of it is nonsense. And this is kind of what I mean when I said earlier, I'm not sure the SEC has done a great job protecting traditional securities investors, because the whole thing is a box checking paperwork exercise about like just follow the procedure and not really anything from a first principles basis of what protects people. So, you know, honestly, like this is a subset of problems with disclosure in general. And there's people who have written and talked far more about that than I ever will. But to me, it's just a continuation of that trend.
Well, the reason I did it is let's pull up John Reed Stark, former SEC chief, very known to be as anti-crypto as you get. But basically, his tweet was that he was saying that he viewed this as potentially a basis for denying the spot ETF. He took issue with this 90% chance that the spot ETF is going to be granted. I actually don't have the tweet, but basically John Reed Stark's tweet was that. And he implied, Austin, that basically we could be about to witness what I'll call the greatest regulatory rug pull in history if the SEC denies a spot ETF when the market is priced it in almost at 100%. And so that's why I bring it up. And do you think that's John maybe engaging in a little bit of farming, or do you think there's that Gensler's hatred for crypto could cause him to require this and then turn around and say, oh, you didn't, you know, there's too many risks involved, we're going to deny it?
Well, so first of all, this goes back to like the problem with the SEC's action. The SEC is not a merits regulator. They're just supposed to say, did you disclose all these things fairly? And do investors understand what they're getting into before people get into these sorts of things? Like they've had this problem with many other asset classes previously, not quite as vociferously as with crypto, where, you know, they you know, I've jokingly said have done an exceptional job of protecting American retail from gains by forcing everything into private markets because of this kind of behavior. So one, could they rug pull it? Yes. But I would tell you, I think if the SEC thinks that's a good idea, now they're on a direct collision course with some of the other regulators. The CFTC definitely does not hold the view that Bitcoin is a security. And I think they would have words if this comes out. I think it would be challenged in court immediately. And I think the SEC, given previous comments about Bitcoin coming from people at the SEC, would have an exceptionally tall hill to climb to make that stick. It is exactly the kind of thing that, you know, down the road, they've already set themselves up this way, but would add another log to the fire, potentially getting smacked around pretty badly as they move up the ladder in courts, right? Because right now they face the problem, Ripple's a great example of this, of rulings that undermine some of the stances that they've been taking, which is, again, not to say certain things were security transactions or not, but Judge Torres was not having the embodiment theory. Right. So now if you want to climb that ladder, are you really going to take that all the way to SCOTUS? Because Ripple will take it there, given their, like, if you think federal courts so far have been skeptical with the SEC, I think given the current, like, composition of SCOTUS and them seeming to hate all administrative agencies, you know, I've joked with people, but it's like joking, not entirely joking, that the current SCOTUS is going to read the 40 Act and be like, guys, we don't see anything about the internet in here. All of this is not allowed. Like, go back to paper tickets.
Right. Well, you know, I would think that if it wasn't for the Grayscale Court of Appeals decision, then I would think the chances of that regulatory rug pull would be significantly higher. But
if you do that after the appeals court decision, when it was not previously disclosed to the appeals court, and it would implicate potentially the futures ETFs, like, again, this is how you get yourself into Armageddon with a federal judge, right? Is that you do something that is clearly not legit after they have given you an order that they expect you to obey. This is when you end up with like a national injunction banning the SEC from litigating crypto until they make rules.
Right. So, and it's interesting. Let me first ask you, though, in your testimony, you talked about how the crypto industry is being pushed overseas. My question to you, that's a fact. I can tell you as lawyers who have advising companies sometimes. There's been today, a lawyer is advising two things. One, don't cooperate with the SEC.
Yes.
Like, don't volunteer anything whatsoever. That's a sad statement, but that's the case. And two, just exclude U.S. investors on everything, right? And so my question is, do you think we've reached the irreversible mark, or do you think that, because I could tell you were sincere, Austin, when you said it pains you as an American to say that. And my question is, do you think that it's irreversible, or do you think there's still plenty of time for the U.S. to become, sort of the blockchain innovation capital of the world?
I don't think it's irreversible, but I also don't think there's plenty of time. I would tell you, if within a year after the next election, we haven't sorted this out in a way that is at least fair to the good operators in the space, entrepreneurs and people who want to obey the rules, then it's too late. And the reason I say that is, I work with regulators globally. In general, I have decently positive opinions of some of them. I know that puts me out of step with many people in crypto, but it is what it is. I say what I believe. And I think where we're headed is this. Right now in the United States, it's primarily been viewed as the actions of this administration, Senator Warren, Gary Gensler, and a few other allies. If we have an election and there's some degree of turnover, we pass legislation and, to be blunt at this point, given their credibility issues, related to what you just said, reform the SEC, I think we're fine. I think at that point, people will be like, okay, that was a few rogue people. They got voted out. Things have rationalized. Life is good. I think if this continues for another 4 years through the next Congress, two Congresses in this case, and then, presidency, it's too late. Because the problem you'll have there is other jurisdictions are moving. If you look at all of Singapore, Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, the UAE, the UK, Europe, they're moving on this stuff. They have clear rules, clear regs, the ability to do business. 6 years basically from today is the point I'm talking about. At that point, companies are scaling, systems are being built. Americans are largely not included unless they're willing to transact offshore in ways that get rid of that problem. And nobody will trust the US government. We kind of end up where we are with semiconductors, which is when you realize it was a mistake, it's too late to get it back. Right? Because the transition costs at that point are high and they don't trust you. Right. So I really think the answer is 2024's election determines the majority of crypto's fate in the United States.
I'm 100% with you. I've been someone, I don't know if you know this, and you probably wouldn't, but about a year ago, I kept saying in an election year, we're never going to get anything from Congress. I mean, to pass the House, the Senate, be signed by the president, and this divisive Congress, in addition to an election year, I didn't see it. And I saw that the end of 2025 being really when it can get done. And I don't know if you share that timing perspective or, and that's why my point was we have to fight in court, which of course we have, and we've been successful as an industry. But do you think it happens in 2025, a year after the election?
Well, I'll say, I think it needs to be broken down a bit. I am more optimistic on stablecoins potentially happening in 2024 because that is starting to become something that exists outside of just crypto. It's getting interesting to the banking regulators purely from a treasury funding and traditional markets angle. So I think that could be part of a budget bill. I know it is a personal interest to Representative McHenry, who is retiring at the end of this Congress, so he's not going to be there in the future. By the way, big loss for the industry. I would say, him leaving in terms of his stature and gravitas is probably one of our best allies. So that is unfortunate. But, I can also understand why he might be a little bit frustrated with Washington. So, I think stablecoins can move faster. To be honest, market structure is complex enough that I don't expect that to move in the current Congress. I do think that's a 2025 line item. Okay. And I also think as we look at the stuff coming out of Senate banking, given that we're now finding out that most of Hamas's funding came from non-crypto sources and news continues to break about that, the reality is if they don't largely make the bill about that and crypto is a sideshow, it gives their opponents all the ammo they need to say no, because then obviously, if Hamas raised, what's the number? Like maybe some low tens of millions in crypto, but 7 billion from illicit securities trading, and you want to go after crypto, it's not credible. Right. And so, I think of all of these forces colliding, stablecoins actually maybe. And I would also say, I think that's a question of the banking regulators need to come to the realization that in the future world, you have two options, which is, yes, stablecoins well regulated in the US, or yes, stablecoins elsewhere, right? No stablecoins left the barn in about 2014. So, again, the semiconductor analogy was raised for a reason.
Right. Any thoughts on how that proposed stablecoin legislation impacts USDC and Tether?
So if you look at the way the legislation is written, it would require USDC, especially at their size, because I think in the final legislation, here's my guess. Yes. They would put some threshold in there saying if you're below this threshold, you can be state regulated. But if you breach that threshold, you probably need to be federally regulated, which, by the way, makes a ton of sense, because I don't think the Federal Reserve wants to spend time on the $2.5 million yen stablecoin from GMO in New York. But I also don't think anybody thinks Alaska should be regulating like a $200 billion US dollar stablecoin, right? So I think it'll require Circle to register nationally, probably transform their legal form factor, things of that sort. That's fine. You could do it. Okay. Tether, if they want to keep operating, they're going to have to register and follow the rules and be more transparent. Now, with that said, I would tell you, Tether to me, I think has always been better intentioned than people think, but pretty jankily run historically, and that they deserve some criticism, but they've probably gotten about 5 times the criticism they deserved. So it's like a weird inverse of FTX, right? In many ways. But this bill would provide a path to, if you want to be a stablecoin tradable in the United States, you behave in this way. And if you don't, get out.
Right. Okay. No, and there's so much rampant speculation that the next hammer from the SEC or the U.S. government is going to be Tether. There's just that rampant speculation going on. And
that I think is, what's the easy way to say this? How? Right. Tether has no U.S. persons. Right. They have no U.S. customers. They have no direct nexus of U.S. business. So how are you going to go after Tether? You kind of have to do one of 3 things. One is to say, well, they're secretly serving U.S. persons anyways, and we think we can prove it. I actually think that's very hard with Tether because they actively do not. Right. You could thank their previous brush with death with the NYDFS for that. 2, you've got to give Treasury what they wanted, which is to say you now have the powers that a dollar transacted anywhere globally is under your remit. I do not think the United States will enjoy the repercussions of that action, because you will provoke similar counter moves from other people, right? Like, just logically speaking, if a dollar traded in Japan between 2 Japanese banks is under U.S. control, then CDS on a Japanese company traded between 2 U.S. banks is under Japanese control, right? There's going to be some major reciprocity issues with that sort of behavior. And my guess is Senate banking does not, much less the House, have the appetite to give them those powers. So that becomes hard. And then the third is trying to get to them through some FinCEN, criminal, OFAC, KYC, AML action. But counterpoint, there was just a freezing of hundreds of millions of dollars of criminal funds by Tether, in which the DOJ was complimenting them for working with law enforcement. So that would be a little bit two-faced, right? And so the reality is Tether is just a pretty regular participant in the Eurodollar market. And so picking a fight with Tether is picking a fight with the Eurodollar market, which, for those who are not familiar with that terminology, it's not dollars in Europe. That is all dollars traded outside of the U.S. banking system, of which there are a lot. Tether is a rounding error.
Right. Oh, no, so as far as legislation goes, we've got the House stablecoins that you believe has a fair shot this year?
I'd put it, I wouldn't say this year. I mean, it's getting pretty tight, but I'd put it in a coin flip before the election, because again, so if you look at that one, it's got some Democratic proponents, right? Like Wiley Nickel, Richie Torres, others, right? Like, that's not an exhaustive list. Maxine Waters and her staff have worked on it in the past. And I would tell you, I've worked with a lot of the House staff. I think they're better intentioned than people think. A lot of them are very good people. Like, I can't say who, but I was down in DC recently, and had a 2-hour discussion of which 5 minutes was crypto and like an hour and a half was parenting and children and values. So like these are good people is my point. And one of the things I'd like the crypto people to stop doing is assuming they're all cartoon villains, because they're not. Right. I think the reality is it's just a hard political problem to solve right now. And what that means is we're in a world where you've got to align all of these forces across the Senate, across the House, and across the president to get something passed. And that means in Washington, you'll do it when you have something to trade. So the reason I'm a little bit optimistic about stablecoin is in our eventual budget deal that ends this incessant like showdown type problem. I think that might be part of it.
Okay. There's obviously fun bills out there, like limiting the SEC chair or whatever. I mean, those are probably never going anywhere. Would you agree? Or do you think that there's teeth to them?
I would say most of them are not going anywhere. I would say the one that I've started to change my opinion on actually may be reforming the SEC. Given that they are now putting themselves in position to get sanctioned by federal judges and their conduct is being called out in the way it is, and they have now created an industry paradigm where an entire industry is basically engaging in complete non-compliance and unwillingness to work with them. I don't think necessarily, Warren Davidson's bill, and by the way, shout out to Warren Davidson. He's another ally of crypto. And right, I don't agree with, Representative Davidson on everything, but he has consistently been on the side of people having due process rights and getting fair treatment in this space. And I think very highly of his efforts. His bill is probably, a little bit too, call it punitive, right. But I think something actually dramatically reforming the SEC could be on the table, given that may be the only path to getting them back to functioning properly.
All right. Well, as we wrap up, let me ask you one thing. I'm envious of you. I used to be a professor at a law school, and I liked it. It certainly wasn't for the pay, but it was just keeping in touch with young folks. Yes. You know what I mean? Much younger than me. And as a college professor, as you're meeting the younger generation, can you gauge their interest in this industry? Is it there? Is it, or, sometimes we live in this crypto Twitter universe and we forget that the rest of the world, I think less than 2% of the world own Bitcoin. You know what I mean? And so what's your take on that? What are you seeing?
If you're being honest, at a school, it's always a little bit of a mixed bag, right? Like there are plenty of jokes about the MBA indicator being that, when MBAs are going into something, it's the top. And there's a little bit of truth to that. With that said, there's also some people who are deeply committed to the space. I would say if I look at the students that I had in my last class, I would tell you probably 1/3 are deep crypto believers. 1/3 are what I would call crypto curious. And one of the uniting things there is that they probably are a little bit of bank skeptics. And then I would say another 1/3 are probably crypto skeptics, but like genuinely interested in the space, like not of the John Reed Stark unhinged screaming variety, right? Like apologies, John, but he knows I disagree with some of his views here, but more in the form of like, I don't understand why people are doing this. Isn't the current system fine? Like, why would I use this stuff? And to me, anybody's welcome in my class if they just genuinely want to learn. And so what you really see there is this diversity of viewpoints. What I will tell you is that after seeing a little bit of a dip, thanks to crypto completely crashing and burning, but not that much, attendance is already on the way back up as a trend. And to me, like the real thing this tells you is one, the space is not going away. And two, I think the real lesson to take from young people, be it crypto or otherwise, is they are not satisfied with the way the current system works and do intend to do something about it.
Oh, that's great. Well, listen, Austin, it's been great. Thank you so much for taking the time. For the audience out there, we're going to go from this week to talking about legislation and Congress to next week. I got Raul Paul coming on. We're going to get into a little bit of the markets. But Austin Campbell, keep doing what you're doing, brother. I consider you a warrior out there for the industry. We may agree on most things. We may disagree on some things, but I certainly respect you. I'm a big fan of what you're doing, and I want you to continue doing it. All right.
Well, thank you, John. The feeling is mutual, and I appreciate you saying that. And for everybody out there, one thing I'd emphasize that John just said, sometimes the disagreements between reasonable people is where the really interesting stuff is. You should always pay attention when you see that.
Absolutely. That's the perfect way to end. Everybody have a good week.